Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today we're going to be continuing to walk through this book here. I've introduced this book in the previous video. There we go. It is entitled The Impossibility of the Contrary. Without God, you can't prove anything. Not sure that's in the shot there. There we go. And basically what we've been doing is walking through the ends of each of the chapter. There are study questions. And so I've just been going through those study questions and sharing my thoughts on each of those questions with the hopes that this adds kind of supplementary detail to your own study of the book. If you own this book and you're working through the book, hopefully what we talk about here is useful to you. And if you don't have time to read the book, that's why I have read it for you. And I'm walking through the study questions. And last episode, we did chapters 1 and 2. This episode, I think I'm just going to focus on chapter 3. Okay. And then we'll work our way through. It really just depends on how much I have to say about each of the questions. There's about like 8 questions. Let me see if there's in the end of the other chapter here. Are there? Yeah, there's about 8 questions or so at the end of each of the chapters. So typically you can spend a lot of time because they cover some of the main themes in each of the chapters, which you would imagine, we can spend lots and lots of time talking about each of them. So we're going to be focusing on chapter 3. So chapter 3 is entitled, let me get the title here, The Inconsistent and Fallacious Arguments. Okay, and so we're going to be going through the question. Now, I have my coffee with me. I like to have the comfortable, environment and ambiance. So I like to have my coffee with me. We're past Christmas, but I have my Christmas mug here. Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bonsenu. Bonsenu aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bonsenu Plus and Bonsenu Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. Oh, man. If you guys know me, I am a big coffee guy. Coffee and Jesus, but not in that order, if that makes sense. All right. So let's jump right in. So these are the study questions to chapter 3. Okay. And I really like the first question, and I like how Dr. Bahnsen addressed it in the body of the chapter. The first question goes for the following. What 2 approaches to apologetics are presented at the outset of this chapter, and which is wisest and most effective, and why? Now, what Dr. Bahnsen begins in the chapter, he begins with this scenario, like this hypothetical scenario. He says something along the lines of, suppose you were going to enter a room with another man who has a loaded revolver, a gun. How would you prepare before going into the room to interact with this man with a gun? Would you, A, learn and master the art of dodging bullets? Okay, you walk into this room, the guy's shooting at you, and you are, moving to the right, moving to the left. You're trying to bob and weave and survive that way, okay? Or would you prepare by mastering the art of removing the gun from the person's hands, right? Just to take the gun away from the person altogether. And of course, the wisest choice is to master the art of removing the weapon from the hand of the gunman, okay? Because of course, if you shoot, 1 bullet, you have more bullets, you can keep shooting, and if he reloads, he can, you get the idea. That is obviously not going to be as effective in terms of dodging bullets. It's not going to be as effective as taking the gun out of the person's hands. Now, if we transfer this over into apologetics, which is the better method of apologetics? Is it the method that engages in answering specific objections, okay? You're dodging bullets, so to speak. Or is it the method that is able to undercut the entire foundation of the unbeliever, the foundation that allows the objections to rest upon. They're the foundations upon which the objections arise. Okay, and so Dr. Bahnsen here is suggesting that the presuppositional apologetic approach is more like learning how to remove the gun from the hands of the gunman. Now, that being said, I want to highlight this. That is not to say that the Christian apologist should not answer specific objections. We should learn how to answer specific objections to the Christian faith, right? We're not avoiding that, okay? So if someone were to ask me, what is the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I have no problem giving them that historical evidence. Or if someone were to say, why do you trust the Bible if the Bible is filled with contradictions, right? There's nothing wrong with saying, well, what do you have in mind? And they bring an example and you try to reconcile those apparent contradictions. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think if we allow our apologetic to rest on that level of just answering objection after objection after objection without addressing the foundation upon which those objections arise, then we're not really getting to the heart of the issue. And so Dr. Bahnsen here is suggesting that if we learn how to remove the gun from the hand of the objector, that is a much more effective approach. And this is where I think presuppositional apologetics really shines, because it focuses upon kind of that worldview level, right? Where we're not arguing over simple facts of history. We could interact with that. We should, we ought, right? But can the unbeliever even make sense out of the entire enterprise of history from a non-Christian perspective, right? How do they account for the historical method? How do they account for, the laws of logic or the uniformity of nature or these things that we often just take for granted? So we could answer the objection, we should and we ought, but we could also strike at the very foundation of the unbeliever's worldview and remove the gun out of their hand. If we destroy the worldview, then what crumbles along with that is the objections that the worldview is based. Now, this is important because a lot of people think that this is a problem. They'll say, you guys focus, you presuppers focus on worldview so much because you do that to compensate for your lack of evidence for your position. Okay. Now, when someone says that, I don't want you to take the bait. All right. Okay. To address worldview issues is not to suggest that we do so because we can't talk about the evidence. That's not the reason why. We can talk about the evidence. But what happens when we talk about the evidence with the unbeliever? I give my facts, the unbeliever gives his facts, I give my facts. We go back and back and back and forth, and we never address the issue, the main issue, the interpretive lens by which we are interpreting the facts. And so it's important to understand that while we can talk about the facts, it is not wise to endlessly talk about the facts without first addressing the philosophy of fact. Now, you don't need to do this every time. You don't need to do this in every interaction with someone, okay? Every time someone asks me a question about the Bible or, something apologetics related, my first response is not to say, well, how do you make sense out of any? No, I like to address people's questions. And, people are at different levels. They're at different stages in their thought. And I want to hear what they have to say. And I want to thoughtfully provide a response to the specific question that they're addressing. But once I see those things come up where it's clear that the presuppositions are hindering them from seeing the truth of what I'm suggesting, then I begin to dig a little deeper, and kind of like a dentist who drills down a tooth and tries to get to the nerve, I try to bring things down to that foundation and hit the nerve to highlight where the true disagreement is. And then that's where I bring in the worldview issue. So you can start with worldview issues, and there's nothing wrong with that. But obviously, we don't always have to do that. Okay, just know that when we're talking about the facts, when we're talking about data and evidence, okay, we always have to have one foot already on the issue of worldview, since it's the worldview that gives the context for the meaningfulness of those specific data points and facts that we are debating with the unbeliever. Okay, so the two approaches that Dr. Bahnsen suggests is learn how to dodge bullets or learn how to remove the gun from the person's hands. And he's suggesting that removing the gun from the person's hands is the most effective way, and I agree with him. All right, second question. Let's see here. Such a practical question. The first question here, and again, if you're just tuning in, The impossibility, there we go. The impossibility of the contrary. Without God, you can't prove anything, by Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Okay. I love the study questions at the end of each of the chapter. They do so well in helping reinforce everything you've read in the chapter. So I love this because I teach logic to middle school students at a Christian private school. And so this is a great question. Why is the study of logic valuable to everyone, not just philosophers? That is a great question. Now, logic is an incredibly valuable tool, not just for, highfalutin ivory tower philosophers, but it's valuable for everyone because it helps us to think clearly. It helps us to analyze arguments, to reason consistently. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that studying logic is one of the ways that we fulfill the greatest commandment. I mean, when we read Luke chapter 10, verse 27, Jesus says that we are to love the Lord it is written that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our strength, and with all our mind. And so when we study logic and apply it to our thinking, we're using our God-given minds to honor him. All right? Think about that. If you really think about it, God is a God of truth, okay, and consistency. All right? He's always consistent with his word. He doesn't contradict himself, and his thoughts are perfect, right? As people made in the image of God, we're called to reflect our maker. And so if God is truthful and consistent, then we ought to be truthful and consistent in how we think and how we live and how we reason, right? Reasoning logically and reasoning clearly is one of the ways that we reflect God's nature and bring him glory in the way that we think. It is not honoring to God when we are sloppy thinkers. Okay, God calls us to use our minds, to engage our minds, to reason. Okay, contrary to popular opinion, presuppositionalists do not disparage the use of our reasoning abilities. Okay, I'm not against using reasoning. Okay, Van Til wasn't against using reasoning. Greg Bahnsen wasn't against using reasoning. Okay, I think that reasoning is essential for the Christian. What do we reject as presuppositionalists, as Christians who believe the Bible, right? I reject autonomous reasoning. Reasoning that does not itself rest upon the foundation of God and his word. There's a difference, okay? So we're not rejecting reasoning, but rather we are embracing a kind of reasoning that is rooted and grounded on the firm foundation of God and his word, and we seek to reason and argue and utilize logic in a way that is functioning under the lordship of Jesus Christ and giving glory to God in how we use our mind, okay? So I also think that studying logic is a fulfillment of the creation mandate. God has called us to exercise dominion over creation and steward the world for his glory. And so to do this well, we need to be able to think carefully, make sound decisions, communicate effectively, all which require logical, consistent reasoning. And so I think that logic as a ministerial tool, right? Logic is not lord over everything else. It is a tool that God has given us, right? We use that to have dominion, right? And bring creation under the lordship of Jesus Christ, and everything that we do and say it abounds to his glory. Okay. And you can't, obviously you can't forget 1 Peter 3:15, where we're commanded always to be ready to give a reason for the hope that's in us. Okay. If we are to fulfill that command, then we need to be able to think logically and be reasonable and all this sorts of stuff. How do we give a reason for the hope that's in us? Okay. We have to be able to organize our thoughts and communicate biblical truths in a way that makes sense, in a way that reflects what God would want us to speak. And all of these things require an application of logic. And so everyone, because 1 Peter 3:15, for example, is a command for all believers, and it requires logical thinking and consistent thinking to do effectively, then I think it is valuable because, it helps us obey God more effectively, if that makes sense. All right. That's a great question. I really appreciate that question. If you think about it, our thought life and our reasoning is itself an act of worship when we do it for the glory of God. We intentionally think and reason and do the things that require our mind. We do it in a way that brings about glory to our Maker, who blessed us with the very capacity to use those tools that he's given us, right? So important. All right, moving on to question 3. Now, question 3 is the following. What is an ad hominem fallacy, and what are some examples? Why do ad hominem attacks seem more powerful than they are? Okay. Now, this is a really important concept to understand, especially in today's world, in online debates and apologetics and things like this. The term ad hominem literally means against the man. And it's when someone attacks a person instead of attacking their argument or their position. Okay. So for example, if I were to say, you shouldn't believe Johnny's argument, or we'll use myself an example. You shouldn't believe Eli's argument because Eli, he's a grimy presuppositionalist. And we all know how presuppositionalists are running their presuppositional apologetic script. I hear this stuff all the time. Okay. Now that is an ad hominem because it does not address the actual arguments I give. Okay. And I do provide arguments. When people say, well, you've never provided an argument, you just make an assertion. No, people follow this channel. You could disagree with the arguments that I put forth. But to say I don't offer an argument I can't help you if that's your position, even though I've even laid out premises and things like this. Maybe you think I've defended my argument insufficiently. That's fine. But to suggest that I don't give arguments and I just make assertions, or that's what presuppositionalists do, it's just, okay. You can say that. Saying so doesn't make it so. So an ad hominem is when someone attacks a person's character, attacks the man, instead of actually speaking to the argument, their position that they're putting forth. Right? You can't trust atheists because atheists, those atheists are dishonest, or whatever the case may be. Right? You're attacking the person instead of their actual position, and that is an ad hominem, and that is it. And that's a fallacy, okay? And Christians do this too. You have to be very careful. This is why, getting back to that previous question, why is logic valuable? Well, it, amongst other things, apart from the things that I mentioned in my answer to the previous question, when we learn logic, it allows us to avoid logical fallacies, right? An ad hominem is a logical fallacy. We do not get to the heart of an issue by attacking a person, okay? We need to address their actual arguments. Okay. And so we want to be very careful with that. That's an ad hominem. You want to avoid an ad hominem. Again, ad hominem against the man. You are arguing against the man, not against the person's, their actual position. All right. Okay. Question number 4. Question number 4 asks, what does it mean to reduce your opponent's argument to absurdity, and how do you do it? And give an example. Okay. Now, this is very much related to what I've discussed in this channel, what we call an internal critique. Okay. So in apologetics, we're arguing worldviews, Christian worldview, non-Christian worldview. When we do an internal critique, what we're doing is we are seeking to do what we call a reductio ad absurdum, to reduce the opponent's position to absurdity. And what we do here in an internal critique is we hypothetically grant the truth of the person's position to show that if the position were true, it leads to these kind of absurd results. Okay. And you could do this in any number of ways. So, someone will say, I'll give a popular example. If someone were to say all knowledge comes through sense experience. So if you know something, there's nothing that you know in your mind that did not first pass through your senses, right? If we can use that terminology. Okay. And a reductio ad absurdum, or reducing a position to absurdity, you can critique that. If someone were to say, all knowledge comes through sensation, and we could ask the question, okay, let's hypothetically grant that that's true. Well, how did you come to know that statement itself? Namely, the statement that all knowledge comes through sensation. Now, if the person came to know that apart from their senses, then on their own position, they wouldn't know it to be true. You see how that works? So if their position is true, all knowledge comes through senses, but they didn't come to know that through their senses, then if their position is true, it's false. And so that would be an example of reducing a person's position to absurdity. Hypothetically, grant the truth of the perspective and try to show that if it's true, it leads to some absurd conclusion. You see how that works? So, and again, it could be easy in some cases, and in some cases more sophisticated and require a little bit more thought, but that's basically an example of what I would give. So, reducing someone's position to absurdity requires us to do a little bit of what we call internal critique. Okay. And that's very, very important. And I've discussed this in more detail in other videos, but just to answer this question specifically, that's and how do we do that? How do we do this in terms of conversation? Is let the person know. You're talking to the person. Say, hey, well, I think your position is problematic. Let's explore that. Let's assume what you're saying is true, and then we kind of lay out the things that would result. And hopefully, when you show the absurdity of the person's position, it's not for the purpose of making, the person you're talking with feel stupid or dumb or whatever. Hopefully you want to show them, see what happens if what you say is true. Look at this absurd thing that results. And we do that with the hopes that the person can kind of follow your line of reasoning and by God's grace, recognize the faulty nature of his reasoning. Now, that being said, that can be done both ways. Okay. We can use bad argumentation and hence in some cases be shown to hold to a position that, if true, would lead to certain absurdities. Now, that's not intrinsic to the Christian worldview. Obviously, I don't think the Christian worldview it can succumb to a legitimate reductio ad absurdum. But there are certain lines of reasoning that Christians can use that if we granted these fallacious lines of reasoning, something absurd would result. We want to be careful to recognize it in others and also to be wary of that in the way that we think and the way that we reason, right? Because remember, if using logic and reason and thinking is to be done to the glory of God, we want to make sure that we're doing it correctly, right? And so, again, we don't honor God by arguing in a fallacious fashion, all right? So we want to be aware of that, all right? All right, that's question 4. Let's see here. Question 3, okay. Or I'm sorry, question 5. I failed math. After 3, we go to 5. No, we just did question 4, and now we are on question 5. All right. Let's see here. Question 5 says, what are some of the absurd implications of cultural relativism? Okay, in the book, it talks a little bit about cultural relativism. Now, in this chapter, Dr. Bahnsen discusses why cultural relativism, let's define our terms. Okay, so in this context here, in the way that's being used, cultural relativism is the idea that morality is based entirely on culture. So morality, so like rightness and wrongness, these sorts of things like ethics, is based entirely on culture. And so that each society determines what's right or wrong. And so in this position, there's no universal standard of right and wrong. And so, it sounds tolerant when you think about it, right? There is no absolute right or wrong. That's just your opinion. I have my opinion, these sorts of things. That sounds great. But when you take a closer look, it falls apart. Dr. Bahnsen kind of goes into more detail in the chapter. Now, Dr. Bahnsen gives a great example of this with Margaret Mead's famous work. Mead studied the sexual practices of unmarried Samoan girls, and interesting topic there, and found that their cultural norms didn't align with the American emphasis on chastity. Okay, and then Bahnsen talks about this in this chapter. And from this, she concluded that all moral values are relative. Right? Think about that. Because cultures disagree over what is right, and therefore there is no objective right or wrong. Okay. And of course, hopefully you can see that that is a logical leap, right? You cannot move logically from the observation that there are different more understandings of morality. Therefore, morality is simply rooted in culture, right? So if I observe all the cultures in the world and I observe that each culture has differences in their understanding of ethics and things like that, it does not logically follow that therefore ethics, objective morality, these sorts of things are relative to the culture, right? It just doesn't follow. Okay, so and then he uses examples. The common examples that he refers to, and this often comes up in apologetics, right? If cultural relativism were true and cultures determine what's right and wrong, and he uses this example, and you can see this in other books as well. So then we would not be in a position to condemn Nazi Germany for their murder of over 6 million Jews, because that's their culture. And what right do you have coming from an American culture to look at the culture over there in Europe and say that was wrong, right? And there are some people who bite the bullet and say, yeah, we don't have a right to do that, okay? But of course, if you think about it, someone says we don't have a right to do that. Well, according to my perspective, I have a right to do that. I have a moral obligation to speak out against those evils. All right. So you kind of see like the problem with holding to a moral relativistic position. So again, he talks about that in the book as well. All right. Question number 6. What are some inconsistencies you might notice between an unbeliever's professed beliefs and his own behavior, and what it indicates about his beliefs? How are these inconsistencies both moral hypocrisy and irrationality? Okay, now this is a really good question, okay? And it's central, I think, to apologetics. The inconsistency between what unbelievers say they believe and how they actually live their lives is a very important thing to keep in mind, right? So let's tackle the first part. Why do these inconsistencies, when you see an inconsistency between what someone says and what someone does, when you see these, you have to understand that this is a form of irrationality and it is a form of moral hypocrisy, okay? We can not only point out contradictions in like arguments, but you could also point out contradictions in terms of what someone says and what someone does, all right? If you think about it, we tend to act upon what we believe to be true. We don't act upon what we don't believe to be true. And so many times the Christian can do this too, but just to use the example of the unbeliever can say something with their mouths, but they don't actually live that way. All right. The issue that comes up is typically is morality. When you're getting into a philosophical debate, the atheist might argue, and I say might because not all atheists, hold to this. Many atheists actually believe that there are objective moral values and duties. But suppose you're in conversation with an atheist who doesn't happen to believe in objective moral values and duties. They'll say, existence is just sound and fury signifying nothing. It really doesn't matter. Morality is just something we developed evolutionarily, that we've evolved to adopt certain behaviors because it caters to human survival and so forth. And then he gets upset when you steal his wallet. He'll call the police and he'll say, hey, I can't believe this person did this. How can they do this to me? There you have, at a certain level, an inconsistency between what the person says and what the person actually does. It's kind of like sitting in a class where, you might be sitting in a philosophy class and the professor might say, well, life is meaningless. There are no objective moral values and duties. It's kind of, it doesn't really matter what you do, so on and so forth. And there are people who say that. And then, of course, when you take the exam at the end of the semester, you decide to lean over your shoulder and copy, the answers of your classmate. And of course, the professor gets upset and says, hey, what are you doing? Well, I'm just looking at his test. I think I like his answers better than my answers. I was like, well, you can't do that. It's cheating. I'm like, and is that wrong? And of course, what's the professor going to say? Is of course that's wrong. You failed. They'll give you a failing grade or whatever. Notice the inconsistency between what the professor professed. Okay, no pun intended. And how he actually lived things out in his actual interactions with his students. You see, that is a form of inconsistency and moral hypocrisy. Same thing with Christians. We can say we believe things and our lives don't always reflect that. Okay, so we got to be careful. It goes both ways there. But regardless in which way we're emphasizing, yes, that is a form of moral hypocrisy, and it's irrational to have your actions contradict what you profess to believe. Okay? All right. That's an important point. If you say you're a Christian, then you ought to live as though you are a Christian, right? If you believe that God exists and his word is true, that should impact our actions. All right? And we want to make sure that our actions, the actions of our hands, are consistent with our profession, right? What we profess to believe needs to be consistent. Our lives need to be consistent, okay? And that's a logical thing to do, and that honors God, okay? All right, question number 7. Moving along quickly here. What are presuppositional tensions? Provide 2 examples that you might find in an unbeliever's view about knowledge, nature, the nature of reality, or ethics. Now, let's start with definitions here. What is a presuppositional tension? Now, one of the great things about this book here, I'm trying to find the best way to put this up without it getting blurred in the shot here. One of the useful and helpful things about this book is that it has study questions, but it also has a glossary section. So if you look here, I don't know if you could see that in the camera there in the shot. It's a little blurry, but there is a, maybe this, no, there we go. It has the term presuppositional tensions. I'm going to read it for you here because he defines it. And in defining it, we kind of answer the question here. Okay. What is a presuppositional tension? Presuppositional tensions. Presuppositions, here's what it is. Presuppositions that don't harmonize with each other. Okay? So you're holding to multiple presuppositions that are in conflict with one another. For instance, a person may believe that everyone should pursue as much pleasure as they can, and at the same time believe that some behavior is wrong and should be stopped, even if it brings pleasure to the one who is doing it. These two basic beliefs conflict with each other, though the person holds both beliefs. They cannot both be true. Okay? That is what a presuppositional tension is. It's when someone holds to two presuppositions that are in conflict with one another. They do not harmonize with one another. Now, within an apologetics context, this is what you want to do. And this is not a secret, by the way. I want unbelievers to do this because I'm of the conviction that everyone at the very heart of the matter, everyone's a presuppositionalist. Everyone has their ultimate commitments. Everyone is impacted by their presuppositions, even though they think they're not. Okay. I don't mind if the unbeliever examines my position and tries to highlight presuppositional tensions. I want to know if I'm holding to presuppositions that are in conflict with one another. Okay. That's not a problem. Now, for the Christian interacting with the unbeliever, one of the effective ways to expose the faulty nature of an unbelieving worldview is to highlight and expose those presuppositional tensions. Okay? When the unbeliever is expressing their view and sharing their beliefs, you need to ask yourself, what is this person's worldview if they don't just come out and say it? What do they believe about the nature of reality? What do they believe about how we know what we know? What do they believe about how we ought to live our lives? And what they believe about those specific categories, that's metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Remember, metaphysics deals with the nature of reality. Epistemology deals with knowledge. How do we know what we know? Ethics deals with how we should live our lives, these sorts of things. Those are worldview foundations. Those are kind of the basic categories of philosophy, okay? When someone shares with me their view, all right, I need to ask myself, I want you to ask yourself that question. Is there something that they are presupposing when they're expressing these views that are in conflict with some other aspect of their worldview foundation? In other words, is their theory of reality, what they believe to be real, in conflict with their ethic? Okay? If their metaphysic is one of naturalism, God doesn't exist, nature is all there is, are they being consistent? Is there a tension between their metaphysic, their naturalism, and their ethic? Do they appeal to objective oughts while holding to a metaphysic of atheism or naturalism or whatever? Okay, if so, there might be a tension there. And the questions that you ask will hopefully you ask the sorts of questions that bring out that tension. Okay, and this is not a secret. This is not like, oh, that's a good idea. That's what we should be doing, and welcome it when the unbeliever tries to bring those parts of your worldview out. We want to be able to, and this is why when someone is questioning us on our faith and they're doing an internal critique of the Christian worldview, the key to surviving the internal critique from the unbeliever is simply to know your worldview, okay? Because what I found is, and many of you might resonate with this, the majority of objections that I hear against the Christian faith are based upon misunderstandings of the Christian faith. Right? They'll assert something, well, you Christians, and fill in the blank, and it's typically not something that I believe as a Christian, okay? Or it does not take into account the nuance of ideas that Christians can believe. And so they'll throw this idea, and they'll be like, that's actually not quite accurate. So how do we as Christians survive the internal critique that the unbeliever puts forth? We need to simply know our worldview, okay? Now, how does the unbeliever survive the internal critique that we engage with them? They need to know their worldview, and hopefully they will be able to express their foundations, and we can get those foundations side by side and really engage in meaningful worldview analysis, comparison, and critique. Okay? So there's no secret here. I mean, hopefully this is what all of us should be doing, right? So nevertheless, that's a good question. I think it's a very thought-provoking one, and thankfully this book has the glossary that helps you understand some of the terms that one might not be familiar with. All right. Okay, so the last question here is, why is it valuable for you to understand and recognize various schools of thought, even though your unbelieving friend might not know he's representing any particular school of thought? That is a very, very good question. When we speak of empiricism, right? Knowledge comes through sensation, experience, so forth. Or rationalism, okay? Or mysticism, or Platonism, or existentialism, or whatever ism, okay? The chances are the average person on the street is not going to know that they are implicitly a proponent of ideas that can be constituted as an ism. Okay? They're not aware, okay? We need to be aware of that. Cornelius Van Til often stressed the idea that Christians must learn to be epistemologically self-conscious. Epistemologically self-conscious. I know it's a big fancy phrase, but it's simply the idea that we are aware of our theory of knowledge. We are aware of our theory of reality. We are aware of our ethical theory and how they work together and how they're always in play in the specific things that we talk about, okay? What we say is a reflection of our philosophy of life, okay? The Christian needs to be aware of that. You want to be aware of the connection between what we assert and the broader philosophy of life of which what we assert is connected to. At the same time, to be effective in apologetic interactions, you want to be aware, or you want to help your interlocutor to be aware that he has a worldview too. He might not be aware of his worldview. He might not know the particular terminology that summarizes his worldview. He might not know he's an empiricist, for example. Okay. He might have to be told that. Okay. You don't need to use that terminology, but to be aware of the background philosophy of the person you're talking with helps you to anticipate objections and to anticipate responses. It allows you to ask the right questions to get to the heart of the issue between you and the other person, okay? Knowing the background music of the person's mind is so important for effective communication. It changes your language. For example, in Dr. Walter Martin's book, The Kingdom of the Cults, there is an entire section. I think it's a chapter. I don't know if it's a section of a book or a chapter of his book, which I highly recommend if you guys have never picked up Kingdom of the Cults. It is a classic in the world of apologetics. Dr. Walter Martin was considered the father of cult apologetics. There is a section in that book called Scaling, I think I'm going to see if I remember it correctly, Scaling the Language Barrier. Scaling the Language Barrier. And what Dr. Martin pointed out is he pointed out the importance of overcoming the language barrier that separated the Christian and the Mormon, or the Christian and the cultist. So when you're talking to a Mormon, for example, Mormons will use words that sound very Christian, but when you actually get to the definitions of those words and those concepts, it is clear that when a Mormon uses the word Trinity, he is not using it in the same way we Christians are using Trinity, okay? Or salvation, or, whatever the case may be. When you talk to a Catholic and the term justification comes up, there's a difference between how they're using the term justification and how we are using, as Protestants, using the term justification. You need to be able to scale the language barrier. You need to learn to speak in such a way that the ambiguity, okay, that is inherent in those kinds of conversations is removed as best as possible. All right. So when you know, or you're familiar with the worldview of the person or the philosophical perspective or theological perspective that they're coming from, that allows you to anticipate the sorts of things that could be said and then address them with clarity, trying your best to avoid linguistic landmines, right? Those words that are not clearly defined because we use similar language, but we're not using the similar definitions, all right? So understanding that someone is an empiricist beforehand is going to be very helpful in communicating with them. If understanding the other person, their form of rationalism that they hold to, understanding that broader framework is going to make me a better communicator. Is it going to make you perfect? Of course not, right? There's always going to be some miscommunication at some point in the discussion, but knowing the background beliefs of someone or being familiar with what they believe is very, very important. Now, suppose you have no clue, all right? You're talking to a person on the street, or maybe you're talking to an acquaintance or something like that. You're not really sure what their views are, and that's normal. So where do we go from there? Right? Eli, I'm talking to my cousin, or he's an unbeliever. I kind of don't know where he's coming from. He's kind of a interesting guy, very eccentric or whatever. How do I get to the core of his worldview? And the way that you do that is very profound. I'm going to give you something. The thousands of dollars in debt from my seminary years, I'm going to solidify everything that I've learned and paid good money for, and I'm going to give it to you right now. Okay? How do we get at someone's worldview presuppositions? Okay, simple. You ask questions, right? When I am talking to an unbeliever, I look for three things. Okay, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. Metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. Theory of reality, theory of knowledge, theory of how we ought to live our lives. What do they believe about these things? My questions will reflect those categories, because I want to extract information, okay? This isn't sneaky. This isn't an underhand. Because you want to address their worldview, you need to have some idea of what their worldview is. How do you gain access to their worldview? Ready? It's not a trick. This is not being deceitful. You ask questions, okay? We ask questions. Hey, well, what do you believe about such and such? What do you believe about such and such over here? Someone might say, well, I don't think that, science has demonstrated, or maybe the person is just only accepting things from science. That tells me something about his theory of knowledge. Maybe he holds to a form of scientism, where all knowledge comes through scientific investigation. That's an important thing to know. And so I'm going to ask questions about the how do you know questions, and what do they say? Based upon what they say, that will tip me off as to where they're coming from philosophically, okay? Now, if you're talking to someone who is a little bit more philosophically astute and aware of these issues, you might just blatantly ask them, hey, are you an empiricist? Yeah, I'm an empiricist, kind of an empiricist. Oh, what do you mean? Can you explain? I think that'll be helpful for me to kind of know what questions to ask, and we can kind of move forward in our conversation, right? Now, of course, there are some people who are not philosophically trained. They're not aware of these issues. And so you're going to have to extract the information in a different way, but you don't want to overwhelm the person. So asking good, spaced out questions, well thought in each of the categories, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. How do I ask an epistemological question? How do you know? What led you to that conclusion? Those are simple questions. Okay. What do you think the world is all about? Do you believe in God? Do you not believe? These sorts of questions give you indicators as to what this person believes about the nature of the world. Okay, man, I only think we go around once. We should just enjoy life. Well, we go around once. So this person doesn't believe in an afterlife. Maybe they don't believe in God, or they assert that they don't believe in God, or they acknowledge that God might exist, but the kind of God that exists doesn't care about us enough. He doesn't give us eternal life because we only go around once. There's not really, these sorts of things. Maybe we're not going to be judged in the future. There's no future judgment, blah, blah, whatever the case may be. We ask questions, specific questions that draw out what the person believes about each of those categories. And based upon what they say, we then begin to look for presuppositional tension. Okay? Is there a conflict between category over here, this unbeliever's metaphysic, and their epistemology or their ethic? Okay? And you ask questions, you allow the person to share and these are genuine questions. They're not meant to trap. Obviously, I'm not an unbeliever. I'm a Christian, so I believe Christianity is true. So if I'm interacting with an unbeliever over the truth of Christianity, I obviously want to know what they believe, understand their position, and then show where I disagree and why I think it's wrong. And of course, the unbeliever is welcome to do that to the believer as well. You want to know what I believe as a Christian? I'm more than happy to go through it and walk through each of the points as best I can so that we could have a meaningful dialogue. So none of this is kind of like underhanded methodology. It's more of how do we communicate with people in a way that we can bring out maybe things that the unbeliever isn't thinking about, namely their worldview, so that we can show these two pictures of reality. This is the Christian conception of reality, the unbeliever's conception of reality. Hey, as a Christian, I really think that the Christian worldview makes sense out of human experience in a way that your non-Christian worldview cannot. And here's why. Let's talk about that. You answer the objections, you address the foundations, and you have hopefully a fruitful discussion and conversation with the individual, right? So it's really helpful. This has been very helpful for me as well, because when I am able to identify someone's kind of background worldview, sometimes in my conversations, I've been able to point that out. It's like, hey, when you said this, there's actually a philosophy that reflects that. And I start unpacking. They're like, that's interesting. I always wondered what that was. I'm like, yeah, but here are my issues with it. What do you think? You could have fruitful conversation that way. All right. Now, to kind of bring this together, though, you want to be very careful is that we want to be able to talk about worldviews with unbelievers in a way that does not get bogged down in the fancy terminology. This is where things can be very difficult. And I've said this in the past before. Many times people will learn apologetics through like a philosopher or someone who uses technical jargon. And so we adopt that language in the way that we talk. You have to understand that you need to not only learn the content, but you need to be able to contextualize the content. Contextualization is so, so important. How do I contextualize words like metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, transcendentals, preconditions of intelligibility, so on and so forth? How can I say those things without using the fancy $100 terminology, right? Because the point is we want to be able to communicate to people. And if you are talking to the average person on the street using philosophical language and in some cases theological language, it's going to be very difficult to communicate in a meaningful way. And so that takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of thought, but ask yourself when you're listening to a video like this or you're reading a book or whatever the case may be, ask yourself, is there another way that I can communicate this same idea to my neighbor, to, Uncle Tony at the dinner table or whoever? We want to be able to contextualize. I mean, Jesus knew how to interact with the religious leaders of his day, and he knew how to interact with the people that he would meet along his journeys, right? There are different audiences. You need to be able to learn how to know your audience and then cater not your message, but the manner in which you communicate the message. Isn't that right? So I teach logic and I teach Bible at a Christian private school. If I taught those topics to college students and you walked into my class, it wouldn't sound exactly the way I would teach it to my 7th graders and 8th graders. That's the grade levels that I teach. Okay. It would be, I'd use different terminology. I'd be going about it in a different way because I now have to cater the content to the proper context. And this is the same thing in apologetics. You just need to be able to identify your audience and begin to communicate with them in a meaningful way. And this is one of the reasons why when you read the writings of Cornelius Van Til, why his writings can be so challenging is because, number one, Van Til, he had a very wordy way of saying things, but the terms that he used and the concepts that he used is such that it reflected a dialogue between his position and the philosophies that were prevalent in his own day. And so he was speaking to the philosophers in his context, which are not necessarily the same philosophers and same philosophical ideas that are in our modern context, which is not the same as the kinds of context that you're going to be interacting with when you're talking to the person on the street, you see? And so Van Til had to contextualize what he was saying, okay? Van Til, writing in the defense of the faith or in his systematic theology, he comes across a certain way, but when you read his little pamphlet, Why I Believe in God, it's a much more down-to-earth, easy to follow way, because that pamphlet is written from a conversational perspective on what does it look like to defend the faith presuppositionally, and it was very easy to follow. So the context was changed, although the ideas, all of the main ideas in Van Til's apologetic were there in that little pamphlet, Why I Believe in God, which I highly recommend. There's actually segments of it. I don't know if it's entirely produced, but in Bonsen's book, Van Til's apologetic readings and analysis, I think it's reproduced there with Bonsen's commentary. But if you can get your hands on the actual, the little pamphlet, I think I have it somewhere. So the thing, when I'm in my chair, is like, I don't know if you guys can't see where I am. This is my spare room in my house. It's really tiny. So like, it's hard for me to like just get up and move. Sometimes I feel like running over to my bookshelf and grabbing a book. It's like, yeah, I can't move. I'm stuck here in this little square. I'm so sorry. If I move here, I might move a wire and everything might tumble down on me. We don't want that to happen. So just take my word for it. There is a pamphlet called Why I Believe in God. It was written by Van Til, and it is Van Til's, it's a presentation of the presuppositional method in conversational style, which is different than his more philosophically deep writings, but it has and captures the essence of what he's getting at when he talks about what it looks like to argue in this fashion. Okay. So highly recommend folks try to check that out if you haven't already. All right. All right. Well, that concludes chapter 3. Now, again, I'm going to be working through this book, but not consecutively necessarily. So my next video might not be chapter 4. I'll be mixing it in with other topics and things like this, but eventually we'll get back to this, and I'll make sure the thumbnails indicate, what chapters each of the videos cover and things like that. And again, leave a comment there in the comment section if you have enjoyed this. I mean, I have a bunch of books that I can go through, and if this is helpful for you, I would love to provide content for you that will be useful in your own study and intellectual and spiritual development. So let me know what you think. Now, there are many other books that I would recommend to you. This, of course, is a great one. There's another one called Against All Opposition, which, again, I think is published by American Vision. And then there was one that recently came out called The Objective Proof for Christianity. And it is a transcription of Dr. Bonsen's lecture series on transcendental arguments. If people are interested in like transcendental arguments and Van Til's specific version of it, highly recommend you guys check that out. If you're more of an audio learner like myself, you can go to apologiastudios.com and even Sermon Audio. And the lectures that of which that book is based are all there, where Dr. Bahnsen gives his lecture series on transcendental arguments. He talks about the history of transcendental arguments, why Van Til's transcendental argument is unique from traditional transcendental arguments. They go over the major objections against it. It's very, very useful, especially if you're studying specifically that issue. Now, if that's too highfalutin for you, that's perfectly fine. I completely understand. But I just got off the phone today with, I think it was a teenager from the UK. And he was asking questions about the transcendental argument. So even teenagers find there are some people out there that think these ideas are super fascinating. And so these resources are out there. So I highly recommend folks get their hands on that. All right. Okay. Well, that concludes chapter. What do we do today? Chapter 3. All right. And so until next time, guys, thank you so much for chilling out with me. And, until next time, guys, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.